And we started with the Mishnah in the 8th Perek on Daf Pei Zayin. And if you recall, the Mishnah mentioned cases where it's complicated to figure out who's manui on which Pesach. So, for example, a married woman, on which of two Pesachim is she menuya? Is it the one that her husband is part of, and he had in mind to include his wife in that menuya on that Korban Pesach, or is it the father of this married woman who had in mind, when he designated together with his other colleagues a different Korban Pesach, he had in mind his daughter? And yesterday we came to the conclusion that she has two choices in this case. Well, let's go over it. As a general rule, unless we know otherwise, which is the case of Redufa, she goes where the husband designates. She's part of the minui of the korban of her husband. She has the right to protest, and she can make a declaration that she doesn't want to be part of the minui of her husband. She wants to go with a different minui. Okay. Now, the Mishnah goes ahead and tells us that if it's the first regel, the first opportunity after their marriage, and she goes to her father's house, then we're in a 50-50 situation. We don't know whether or not she's part of her husband's minui, his chabura, or her father's. And the Mishnah says that Holcha Beregel Rishon Lasos Beveis Avia, she's going to celebrate the Chag in her father's house, which was apparently quite common in the day, and on the first regel, they would go to the father's house, her father's house, right, the bride's father's house. And once again, both the father and her husband respectively brought korbanos on her behalf. Is tochal b'makom she wrote. That's a 50-50 situation. She'll have to decide which korban she wants to eat from, which pesach. And the Gemara thinks, based on that, this halacha is based on what we call yesh breira, that later on, at the time of the achila, she's going to go into that house of her choice. And the halacha is that you have to be part of the minui at the time of shechita, which was done on Erev Pesach. Now it's the night of Pesach, and she's going to make that decision. It's going to have to be Chala Mafreya retroactively back to the time of the shechita. And the Gemara says no. That we're really holding now ein breira. There is no such thing as establishing later retroactively. But rather, when the Mishnah says, Ochal b'makom she rotza, means that she rotza b'shas shechita. So we have to know from her what her decision was, which of the two chaburas, which of the two korban pesach she wants to join at the time of the shechita. She has to make that decision at the time of the shechita. If she doesn't clarify it at the time of the shechita, she can't eat neither from this korban nor from that korban. Because in order to be part of a minui and a part of a chabura to eat the korban pesach, you have to be definite, it has to be certain. It cannot be wishy-washy. So she's going to tell us at the time of the shechita which chabura she joins. Now, the last thing that we did yesterday was to introduce the concept of medufa. And what leads to this concept of redufa it's a brisa which seems to contradict our Mishnah, because the brisa establishes that if she goes for that first yontif after her marriage to her father's house, and she hasn't yet announced which Karban Pesach in this conflict, these two, the tug of war, she wants to eat from, she eats from her father's regel, her father's Karban Pesach. Our Mishnah said that until we hear from her definitely which one she wants to be part of, she's up in the air. Whereas the Brisa says no, she's going to eat from her father's Karban Pesach because it's the first regel after the Nisuin. And only the rest of the marriage, she has the choice which of the two she wants to go to. Now, we said that during the marriage, in our Mishnah, she is, so to speak, committed, unless we hear otherwise, to eat from her husband's Karban Pesach. So that's one contradiction to the Brisa. Number two, if on that first regel they pack out and they find themselves celebrating the Chag with the father, then we said that she'll have to make a decision, B'shas Shchita, because we're holding Ein Brera, which Karban she's going to be part of, which Chabura she joins. And it's 50-50. She can join either one, whereas this Brisa says no. She's automatically assumed to be part of her father's Karban Pesach. Here's where the Gemara introduces the concept of Redufa. And the way we explained this Redufa business yesterday was, does she have a chavivus to base baila? Or, on the contrary, she is constantly gravitating towards her towards her father's house. If she's constantly gravitating towards her father, she's called a redufa. And the Brisa is addressing a case of redufa. In the case of redufa, a woman who is constantly, repeatedly finding herself in her father's house, maybe there's a certain tension in the marriage, such a woman we have more of a reason to assume, until we are otherwise, that she is connected to her father's Karban Pesach. And that's why the Brisa says, Ocheles Mishel Avia. However, if we're talking about the rest of the year, Mikan V'elech, then in the case of Redufa, she'll make her decision. But our Mishnah is talking about a case of Eina Redufa. She doesn't always constantly gravitate towards her father's house. She's chaviv la. She finds herself very comfortable in her husband's house, and therefore, in the case of all the regalim, the balance of the year and the balance of the marriage, she can decide. She is definitely included in her husband's Karban Pesach, unless she declares otherwise. And on the Regel Rishon, she's not a Redufa, then it's a toss-up, and she'll decide which way she wants to. Then the Mishnah goes on to talk about a case of a Yasom, and who's in charge of supervising this young child who has never no parents. It's going to be apotropsin, and now he has two apotropsin. And each apotropis went ahead and designated a Karban Pesach on behalf of the Yosem. Now the Yosem is in a tug of war. And the Mishnah says, Yochal b'makom shurotze, which is a little bit of a chiddush here, that a young child could decide which Karban Pesach he wants to eat from. I mean, that has to be understood, which is hopefully our sugya for today. And then we have a case of two adonim, two masters who own a single eved in partnership. And once again, each adon decided that the eved would go with him and be part of his chabura when they shechted the Korban Pesach. In such a case, the Mishnah says, Lo yochal mishel shneim. He cannot eat from either one of them. And the Gemara is going to figure this out because it has to do with the relationship between the two masters. Are they getting along, or are they trying each one to undermine the other one? Anyway, we'll get to that. And then finally, the Mishnah has the case of Chetzio Eved, Chetzio ben Chorin, and he doesn't get to eat from the Korban Pesach. So let's pick up, now that we've discussed the case of an Isha, of a married woman, let's talk today about the case of a Yasam, and then we'll go on to the case of an Eved. So I would ask you to open up now to Daf Pei Ches. And towards the top of the Amud, on Pei Ches and Aleph, you will see the case of a Yasam. You see Tosas Dibra Maskal Masnisen? It's exactly parallel, if you draw a straight line, to Tosas Dibra Maskal Masnisen. Yasam, it's quoting the Mishnah, Sheshachtu all of Apotropsim, Yochal b'mokom shu rotze, Shamat Mina, shall we derive from this, Yesh Brera? In other words, when the two Apotropsim, each one respectively, includes this Yasam in their Minui, at that point, we went and we shechted the Korban Pesach. We don't know yet exactly which of the two alternative chaburis the Yasam is going to decide, I'm with this one. And it's only later on, when it's time for the Achilas HaPesach, that the Yasam is going to express his desire to eat either with Apotropos A or Apotropos B. How is that going to help us in terms of the Shechita, the Zrikas Adam? At that point, it was uncertain. How could now he slip into the Chabura at the time of the Achila? It's got to be clear that he's part of the Chabura at the time of the Shechita, at the time of the Zrika. So we must be holding Yesh Brera, that we're just clarifying what the situation was initially at the time of the Shechita. So the Gemara rejects this. Amar Rabbi Zera. We're not going to derive from this Yesh Brera. Really, Ein Brera. The Yosef is allowed to eat from that Apotropos' designation, whichever one he chooses. That's because of a pasuk. The pasuk says in Parshas Bo, in the parsha of Korban Pesach, it says Sel lebeis avos, sel abayis. And it seems that the two words sel abayis are redundant. And whenever you have two words that are redundant, or even one word, it's always a ribui to expand the scope of the application and the application of the halacha beyond its initial application. And this is going to establish that the bias for what we call the seh, it says seh, you should take a seh, and it says lebeis avos, and then it says la bias. Mikol makom. Mikol makom means that you could have a bias, which is, again, that's the location where you can eat the Korban Pesach and a Chabura, even though it wasn't clear from the get-go at the time of the Shechita which bias it would be. Which means that the Apotropos could set up a bias on behalf of his client, his Yasam. And even though the Yasam himself is one of the Bnei Beso, he's part of that household or that family that the Apotropos is supervising. Nevertheless, it doesn't matter. The Apotropos doesn't need the das of his Yasam in order to establish the Minu. That's the separate Riva Celabias. And we're not holding that yesh breira l'mafreya when the yosam decides which of these two batim, because there are two apitrops and each one, chaptim for his bias, which one of the two batim he's going to eat with. We don't have to go l'mafreya because of this halach of selabais. Now, honestly, on face value, the Gemara is a pella. Okay, you have a halach of selabais. So what? I mean, we have a strict, rigid rule, a requirement that at the time of the shechita, we know exactly who is manu, and the shechita is done on behalf of the menuyim. Here, the yosam is going to decide later on which bias he wants to join up with, and you're not willing to say yesh breira, but the answer is sela bias. How does sela bias solve your problem? I think that what the Gemara is saying is that what we're going to derive from sela bias, mikol makom, that there's a halacha called a balabais. And I want to explain what I mean by a balabais. In Yiddish, we say a balabas. A balabas means I'm in charge. Every bias has someone in charge of the bias. In the case of a yasam, who is the balabais? It's the apitropos. And all those who are under his supervision, his tutelage, so to speak, are considered his bnei bias. He is the balabais, and they are the bnei bias. And that's the halacha of Korban Pesach. This has a tremendous repercussion. Why? Because we would have said, if not for this special halacha of bias mikol makom, sela bias, that basically anyone who decides on the chabura on behalf of the bnei bias, he's just a shliach. He is operating as a proxy, as a representative, as an agent on behalf of that or that group of bnei bias. The real determining factor or active agent in setting up the minui are the bnei bias themselves. Each one is an agent for himself, and he will determine which chabura he wants to join. And that might be true if the bnei bias are gedolim, let's say a boy who's 13, a girl's 12. But now we're talking about a yasam who is a young child. And the question is, what's the role of the apitropos? Is it A or B? Is it A, that he is serving as the proxy to implement the will of the yasam? Or turn the tables around, on the contrary, he becomes the balabayas who's in charge of the bnei bias. He will set up the minui on behalf of the bnei bias. He's not doing it as a shliach. Where is the power? You follow? These are the two approaches. The power to join a chabura. Is it vested in the yisomim? They are the bnei bias, and the apitropos is just working on their better, for their best interest, but he's nothing more than a shliach. Or fakir, or the opposite is true. In the case of bnei bias, it is the balabayas who takes the seh on behalf of the balabayas. He determines and effectuates the minui, And in the case where there is no balabayas, then the apotropos is the balabayas. I'll tell you the truth, it's almost, I don't want to make this leap of faith, but it's almost like a monetary kind of ownership. Since the apotropos is in charge of all the monetary income and deficits of his clients, meaning in this case the young Yisomim, he now is the balabayas. He's in charge of making a kinyan on a lamb, on a korban pesach, on their behalf, so that even the concept of minui of the korban pesach is like a dini mominus kind of thing. It means to take a lamb, to take a seh for the purpose of a korban pesach is a monetary kinyan. Well, who's in charge of the kinyanim of acquisitions and possessions of the Yisomim? It's the apotropos. He becomes the balabas.
Well, they're katanim, aren't they?
And they are katanim. And if they're katanim, that's all the more reason to insist that the apotropos now becomes the balabayas. Even though, again, at the end of the day, who is eating from the korban pesach? It's the yasam. And we have to figure out exactly how that works, because a katan l'chora is not allowed to eat from the korban pesach. But okay, that's a different sugya called the sugya of chinuch, which we'll get to in Mirza Hashem tomorrow. But assuming that at the end of the day, we're talking about who's the ochel and where's the halachic impact of the minui, it's all the yasam. But nevertheless, the Torah says, sell a bias, that there's someone in charge of the bias. And if you have a father, for example, a biological father, and he has young children, he's the balabas. He does the lekichas ha-pesach on behalf of Banav HaKetanim. And the Banav HaKetanim have no say in the matter. They're not going to decide yay or nay, because he's the biological father. In that sense, he's the full balabais. But now the Torah says sell bias. So it's not just sell avos. Well, what's the pasuk again? I don't want to misquote the pasuk. It's not just lebase avos, but there's another halacha of sell bias. And these are two different halachas. But what's common to both halachas is where is the power invested? And the sell bias as an extension of the avos, of the base avos. So you have two batim here. In a case of a biological father, you have base avos, and he now takes the korban pesach on behalf of his children, young children. He's the balabas, as we say in Yiddish. Literally, he's the balabas. The Torah has given him all the authority, 100%, to decide whether the child will be money on the korban pesach, and which korban pesach, and which chabur is part of it, etc. Now the Torah was marbe, expanding that definition, at least to some extent, of lebase avos, and now we have sell bias. We have another bias. And the chiddush here is a radical chiddush, that the apotropos, like the biological father, now steps into the shoes of the father and becomes the balabas. Again, it's not 100%, because we'll soon see that the yasam still has veto rights. He can decide, I protest. I don't want to be part of this chabur. But nevertheless, in the absence of a protest, it's the apotropos who will decide and generate a halacha of minui, a chalos minui on the korban pesach. Now, what's the nafkamina? What difference does it make? It seems like I'm splitting hairs. Who cares whether the apotropos is the representative of the katan, of the yasam, or that all the power and the authority to generate a minui is in his hands. It's a tremendous nafkamina about Breira. Why? Because if the apotropos is only a representative of the yasam, if not for the special drasha, this ribui, then we have a Breira problem. Why? Because we need the child to decide if he wants to be part of this chabura. He has another option because the other apotropos has him in a different chabura. So we're going to have to wait until the yasam, makes his call, makes his decision. For whatever reason, he decides he wants to go to the right, not to the left, to this bias and not to that bias. He'll go with this apotropos number A and that apotropos B. That's a Breira problem because the child was never part of the minui, because we need ish lefi achlo yachosu ala said that in the time of the shechita, he was already part of the minui and he wasn't part of the minui unless he held yesh Breira. But we're holding now ain't Breira. The answer is that it's not the pshat that the yosam is creating the minui, but rather it's the apotropos who now replaces the father. And selabayis means that in this case, the apotropos is the one who's in charge of all the affairs and the monetary possessions, etc., the income and the outcome and the buying and the selling, etc., of the yasam. He now is vested with the power and the authority to create the minui. Then we don't need both. We don't need Breira. It could be that we have a veto power. That's the difference between the biological father and the apotropos in this case. We don't have two biological fathers who are involved in a tug of war over the child, as we do in the case of apotropos. So because of this tug of war, we're going to grant the child, the yasam, a veto power. He's going to decide, I don't want to go with this guy, I want to go with this guy. But it's not a Breira issue anymore, because we just have to clarify. Like, for example, what's the difference between Breira and a Tanai? In the case of Tanai, I have the power to effectuate the kinyan, but I can make it dependent upon some kiyuma Tanai, which is going to happen later on down the line. Why isn't that Breira? The original Maisa Kinyan is undefined, is not fixed, and it's not set. Depends upon the Tanai. But the answer is no. The point of the Tanai is to allow for a bittul of the Maisa. But the Maisa itself, from its beginning, was a valid Maisa that could generate a chalos. It's not something that needs birur later on. Has nothing to do with yesh breira. That's exactly what's going on here in the minui. Minui is basically, in the case of an apotropos, like a kinyan al Tanai. And the Tanai says that if the yasam decides that he doesn't want to go with this minui, he has a right to do so. Because basically he has two minuyim and both are valid. He'll decide which one he wants to implement. But that's not breira, because the original minui was effectuated by the apotropos himself. Plus epis, I understand, Sela, I understand base avos, but the father is the balabas over his children. But what's Sela bias? And the answer is that in the absence of a bias of a base avos, we have a different bias, and that's the apotropos.
What are they talking about? How many choices are there involved? Is just the apotropos, or is it the apotropos versus the father's property?
No. We have two apotropos, and each one decided that the yasam would hop on board with his korban pesach. And the halacha is that the minui is valid on both sides for each apotropos, and the child at the end, when it's time for achilas pesach, he'll make the decision which apotropos he wants to go with, which designation and which minui, which bias he wants to eat the korban pesach.
He has to have a minui even though he's only a cotton?
In the Havamina, that's what the Gemara thought, and therefore the Gemara thinks it's totally in the Sugya Brera, because later on, at the time of the Achila, he's going to determine the minui of the Shas Shchita. We need a minui b'Shas Shchita. So you're going to have to introduce Brera. Now the Gemara is rejecting that. He's not going to determine the minui. The minui was already set in stone. Again, there's a Tanai. And the Tanai is that we will grant the Yosom the right to decide that he doesn't want to go with this minui. But that's only going to be a bittul Tanai. It's not going to create the minui. The creation of the minui is effectuated by the apotropos himself. Hence, I don't have to come on to the sugya of Yesh Ber. So Rabbi, let's just make a cheshbon where we got up to here. We're up to Taner Rabbanon here on Daf Peches, and at this point, the Gemara is going to shift over to a discussion about minui in the case of a biological father, which we said is derived from the pasuk lebeis avos. And the Gemara is going to analyze the difference between young children and older children. And believe it, in that context, we're going to try to figure out who's allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach. I mean, we're always assuming now that the children are allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach. How does that work? Now, ultimately, what the Gemara is going to do here on Daf Peches, it's going to go back to our discussion about a married woman and make a comparison between the Yasam and the Isha. And then, in Mirza Hashem, we're going to get to the really heavy sugya of an Eved. An Eved who's owned by Shutvim, and do the Shutvim who own the Eved have the right and the authority to create a minu. So that's what's coming around, around the bend. Okay, then. So let me wish you all a great day and thank you so much.
Thank you.